Fernando, tell me as a starting point, a 30-second elevator pitch on EverC and how you came to be in the organization.
So we're basically an AI machine learning company whose sole purpose is basically enable the payments ecosystem, the digital payments ecosystem to be safe of transaction laundering and anything that violates regulation, acceptable use policies, card brands, things of that nature. We work with all the largest acquiring banks in the world. And basically where we sit is when a merchant goes to an acquiring, we go through the KYC, KYB, PEB, address media, first media, all the screenings that anybody does, and then that merchant gets clear from that aspect. And what happens at that point, we get sent all the URLs that merchant wants to process payments in. And our technology basically crawls all the URLs to make sure that the website is what it's being said it is, that there's nothing hidden that violates any card scheme regulations, things like that. And also we bring our graph to make sure that maybe this is Fernando, and yes, this is a bookstore, and the bookstore.com is actually accurate. We also know that Fernando has another store that sells guns or something that may be more big no-no for you. And sometimes we have also a service where maybe they're not providing you a URL. We've been evolving into now helping marketplaces, not only with sellers, but also with product listings. We work with the largest marketplaces in the world as well, where we see up to 30 million product listings in a day. The seller may be a legit seller, and they upload 50,000 products. The example is you can sell melatonin in the US, so you cannot sell it in the UK. So those are the ones that you're like, okay, this is not a bad stuff. It's just a seller that is big, has a lot of things, and is not realizing this is a big no. But if you do it, you are going to have the card brands or the regulator and find also malcoves and IP infringement, and then all of the things that are more sensitive, adult content, weapons, drugs, things of that nature. What sets EverC apart in my view from other vendors in the space is we came as an AI machine learning company first to tackle the problem. And I think that's what's today in our forefront to deal with Gen AI and everything discussed a long time ago. Actually, we were ready and prepared for it. So we also have a team of specialists do deep dive investigations, transaction laundering investigations. We also do services for companies like Discover, which are their own closed loop network, where they want to say, okay, find me anybody violating my uncircular use policy. And we do that for companies like that.
I love the fact that it's not just limited to the KYC and KYB, but your focus on compliance. And compliance is maybe even the limiting term. Playing by the rules of whatever ecosystem is developed. Like, you're trying to get and capture all that information as well for benefit of different parties, it sounds like. That's really cool. So we're talking about these different players in the ecosystem. We've got issuers, we've got networks, we've got acquirers, I'm sure the merchants are there as well. But let's talk about the consumer for a second, right? So on the false positive sides, right? Like, a lot of these competitors you might have may have perhaps more stringent models that perhaps gets one of these merchants like incorrectly flagged, and then suddenly it creates a lot of tension and unnecessary back and forth. So I had read that one of the things that you had done was to actually lower some of these false positives in some of the case studies that I found about your company. So talk a little bit about how like EverC is like able to do what you do from like an accuracy perspective.
So going back, because we came and we started as a technology company, we've been obviously improving accuracy, our speed. And what allows us is, because our technology helps us with pretty short SLAs, tackle about 90% with a pretty decent accuracy. And then the 10% that is more complicated, not play vanilla, those actually sit a little longer to make sure that we're actually not creating that experience. While it's not ideal for any acquiring or anybody in the ecosystem to create friction with the merchants, at the end of the day, it's better to create a bad customer experience to have somebody go through the doors that shouldn't have. Now, that said, like in anything else, the merchants are way more demanding, and it's forcing everybody to get faster. Like if you look at the big ones are tech-driven, like the Stripe for the world, the Adyen, and all of them. Their SLAs for onboarding, from the time you onboard to the time you're processing a payment, is pretty short, and I think it's going to get shorter. And then that creates a problem because on one end you have to be faster, on the other hand, GNI, when it comes to individual merchants, micro merchants and things, for me, I mean, I could very easily create 20,000 first Christians. So it's going to get quite interesting to see, our industry starts to tackling those things at one point. You give like, okay, what do I need to make first? Like the SLA from a customer and client experience versus at this point. And it's the point, right? MasterCard last week here at AGP was talking about scams and how AI, you're getting a video from your father saying, hey, wire me the money and I need this done tomorrow. And you're like, look at it. It's really impressive. So I think that's a conundrum that the service providers will have to deal with. I mean, everybody expects, like at the fingers, everything needs to be there math. On the other hand, it's super sophisticated the way criminals are actually now leveraging technology.
So we're talking about scams. So coming back to the accessibility piece, right? The goal is obviously to help acquirers, as you said, detect fake merchants, fraudulent merchants, et cetera, right? Or find instances where there's some sort of issue with the merchant that maybe needs to be resolved. Especially as you mentioned, you're very global in nature. How do you make sure that your tool doesn't become unintentionally a means to shut out certain market or certain type of merchant through the rigor? Fairness for certain type of SMB a consideration.
I think in our space, we don't go into those details, meaning it's very clear what is legal, what is acceptable by the card schemes. And basically, those are the frameworks. We have also what is called a rules customizer, where the client may set up a different set of rules where some of them are less risk averse than others. We don't want to take gaming, we want to take gambling, we want to take adult, we don't want to take marijuana, which is legal in some states, sometimes. Some are more aggressive on that end. That's basically entirely up to the client.
And they're the ones who have opted into following certain rules or set of rules.
Exactly. Customers, but other risk appetite they can stomach.
And so that leads me to ask about one of your products. I think it's called Merchant View. So tell me a little bit about Merchant View, like how you should think about it from a compliance perspective, and then we can talk about the customization to the extent it exists and how, let's say, an acquirer might want to leverage that customization.
So Merchant View is the merchant onboarding and merchant monitoring solution, basically the product we've been talking about. We have two ways we can integrate. One is through an API where you can feed a customer system and they get the inputs done into it. Or we have our own user interface where you can upload the URLs. The models already are in compliance with card scheme that applies globally, regulation, legislation, things of that nature. Now, onboard the client, we provide training on how to customize their own rules.
They're basically on their own. Okay.
Now they may reach out to customer success and say, hey, can you help me out trying to establish this set of rules or things? But in general, that would be under their responsibility.
Some regulatory bodies, I don't think in the US, but other jurisdictions have brought up, some of these tools to help detect fraud can be deemed as high risk, presumably because they're worried about ability for customization. But from your perspective, you haven't gotten mixed up in any sort of regulatory inquiry for these acquirers, maybe that do go too far with dropping the guardrails, right? They're like, let's actually create a little bit more risk gap, and then they get in trouble for it. It hasn't come back to you from your experience.
If they decide to be lax on them,
that's on them.
They sometimes come to us and ask for us to do deep investigations. We'll provide the results so they can go back to it. But at the end of the day, we are a solution that it's to their own criteria. So if they get in trouble with the regulator for being lax about it, it's on them. Like I said, there's some clients that have a little more appetite on riskier portfolios, but they participate in that.
That's helpful to know. And then just talking a little specifically on some of the regulatory challenges, not for yourself, obviously, but for the acquirers and by extension, the merchants. So one of the things that is a big pain point sometimes in the whole AML, KYC, financial crime space is false positive OFAC hits, sanctions hits, where you're talking about an individual, the name is close. So how do you work with the acquirers and by extension merchants, or how do you work internally to account for some of these? Like, how do you work to minimize some of the friction that could result if somebody was just trying to take the list and literally screen their merchants as is?
We're going to crawl URLs.
Sure.
Right? At the end of the day, if there's no URLs, we're going to come back and say, oh, there's nothing. We don't touch sanctions of us, things like that. Those are done by the client, usually prior to sending. We are sort of like the last step after you go through sanction screening, adverse media, things of that nature. We don't have those issues of participating in those confusions because it's prior to being in our services.
So you're an AI-driven company. You're doing machine learning for quite some time before it became like a big buzzword that everybody's talking about. In terms of how data is stored and how it's used in building this intelligence model, so to speak, is it fair to say it's almost like a consortium of data because you're working with tons of different acquirers who in turn have tons of different versions? You might have referred to this in one of your earlier examples, but do you run into cases where because you worked with one acquirer who has information and maybe you have a stored result for that merchant, then you come up with that same merchant for a different acquirers? Are you able to leverage that past data for the merchant and then basically use it in your decisioning for the next acquirer?
So we do have our graph, which is basically leveraging all the data that the crawlers accumulate throughout our data systems. Today, our crawlers will start crawling, but also we ping our graph and say, okay, what do we know about this? So we do leverage.
Also, it sounds like Market View is the other tool for the marketplace. So just brief overview of that.
What we do is we work with the marketplaces. It's by product listing and categories. Categories could be pharmaceuticals, counterfeits, knockoffs, weapons, things like that. So those are the categories. And then they send us. So when you go to a marketplace and you go through the process, then you put it, before it gets published, the marketplace sends it to us, we screen it and we say, this violates hyper counterfeit, this is not covered. Or we say, good to go. And then we've earned the trust with some of the largest marketplaces take our decision and just basically publish. The way marketplaces control it is you cannot make a change to the product listing, but if you do, they go through the same process. But a real Louis Vuitton, and then I'm going to change it to a
Fake,
knockoff, then it has to go back to the process.
It's good change management, clearly. And one other thing I wanted to ask is we're talking about change management. Let's maybe keep it specific to Market View and marketplaces. You were talking about in the context of merchants, right? Like the acquirers have the card rules. They're responsible from your perspective for staying up to date with regulations, requirements, etc. For Market View, let's say some of these restrictions, especially in different jurisdictions, they change. What's your process for staying up to date with those requirements as they either A, become stricter or B, become looser?
So we have a team that sits on our head of risk and basically stays on top of all these regulations globally to make sure that we align with those. Focus on the regulated markets, which today is the US, the European Union. So we stay on top of those things and make sure that the models are fine-tuned to the regulations. And again, the card schemes basically are the most important. Two things that our clients care about. For the longest time, marketplaces were saying, hey, seller come in, buyer come in, and they match. I'm not responsible for transactions buying something that is illegal. Now that's not flying anymore. Regulation has said that you are responsible for making sure that your marketplace is offering things that are actually legal. And that's why it's prompting learning. Now, a lot of the marketplaces do a first line of defense on their own. They're a tech company, so they build their own models. But there's certain categories and certain places where their own models are not enough because usually a seller is going to do bad stuff in one marketplace. Suppose has like multiple things happening in different marketplaces. So we're able to detect that and be more effective in helping them with that.
Last question here. Thinking about marketplaces and with like things like drop shipping, for example, these have become quite large and complex. And we have Amazon Marketplace, Facebook Marketplace. What do you see as the future for the space, and how do you think others in your space will adapt as things in the overall ecosystem adapt?
I don't have an answer. I don't think Amazon has the answer either, right? There's two steps. One is we are on the front end making sure that the listing is legit, like it's a legit product and it's authentic. That's it, right?
Yeah.
And then the transaction goes through. The problem is at that point, we don't control that the seller actually puts the right product or ships something. And the only way is with central distribution centers controlled, because otherwise, I think at one point probably AI would be like, okay, take a picture of the package and I get it, and somehow AI will keep the picture, like I take the picture of the package I'm shipping you and it's encrypted, and you will take a picture that you got, and somehow the platform is saying it is the product that was shipped, right?
Yeah.
I'm guessing it's a way to head that direction.
Yeah.
It's a little bit where, for example, companies like Nike focus on technology that allows them to make sure to avoid the knockoffs, to say, okay, here's how we're going to tackle that. But you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar problem.
Very insightful. Well, it's been a pleasure, Fernando. Appreciate
Likewise.
your time.